What's going on, everybody? My name's Josh, and this is Beers with an Economist. Are you confused about what's going on with the economy right now? Most people I know are, and that's because most people talking about it are either dumb, have an agenda, or in most cases, both. So today we're going to try to cut through the bullshit, and I'm going to let you in on what's actually happening, what's going on with inflation, and by the end of the episode, I'll let you know whether we're actually in a recession or not. That's what we're going to talk about today over beers. All right, folks. Man, it has been a wild couple of months, and sorry I've been abandoning you over that time period. Summer schedules are hard to coordinate. Now, problem is, over that time, a lot has happened, and we have a lot to cover. Good news is that the data tends to be pointing in a similar direction on all fronts, so I think we've got a coherent story to tell here. Now, first of all, what's happening with inflation? We actually just had some really interesting inflation numbers come out for the month of July in 2022. That would suggest that prices didn't change over the last month, overall CPI. It's a bit of a trick because they still did, right? So fuel came way down, other prices are still going up. If we look at core CPI though, even core CPI is much lower than it's been, about 0.3% for the month, which is a lot better than it's been. So it's about half of what it was the month before that and the month before that. So excellent news on that front. Now, we also just had a banger of a jobs report, right? So we've created over 500,000 jobs, about 528,000 to be precise, and just in from June to July. And so, this is fantastic news. Right? So things seem to be trending in the right direction. Now, having said that, everyone that you know and that you're seeing on the news, that you're reading about on the internet, seems to be trying to will a bad economy into existence, right? And I'm gonna put up a little graph right here. You're not the only one. So consumer confidence is dropping at the same time that unemployment is at a near all-time low, that we have record jobs growth like we just talked about, and inflation is finally starting to come down. So what is the deal here, guys? Well, it is, to put it mildly, a confusing economy, right? We've had a lot of data thrown at us really fast, and it's been changing in a very dynamic way, which is hard to read. Like the tea leaves here are very hard to read. So even, the CPI, I'm gonna throw up another graph right here. It shows it's been bouncing all over the place. And even if you looked at smoothed averages, like that are on this graph, I believe the orange line here, it is showing you that the basically changes in prices month to month have been tremendously volatile. Okay, so it's been hard for economists to know whether what the Fed is doing is working and things like that. Now, this latest report shows us the first signs that perhaps what Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve are doing is actually working. These big rate hikes are signaling to the market that prices are coming down and people's expectations are adjusting accordingly, and we're seeing prices start to come down. Now, that leaves us with the other big question, right? Which is, are prices maybe stabilizing because people are scared to spend because perhaps we're in a recession, right? And again, I cannot overstate how stupid the discourse is about this, with both left and right tripping over themselves to try to tell us that the economy is terrible, right? The left wants the economy to be bad right now because they want to prove that the central bank is hiking rates in an unwarranted fashion and that they could keep those rates low forever and it wouldn't hurt anybody, right? It's this soft MMT desire of just wanting to be able to create money willy-nilly, right? And of course, the right just cannot stand it that the whole world isn't ending because Joe Biden is in office. And so we've got to just, something terrible has got to happen. Otherwise, they were wrong. So what is the real story here? Well, the real story is that the economy, all things considered, seems to be doing just fine, right? Again, I mentioned the jobs report. I mentioned low unemployment. right? We haven't had unemployment this low since the 1970s. It's even lower than when Trump was in office. I hate to tell you folks that are big fans of the former president, but this latest unemployment report shows lower unemployment than we had even under Trump, right? So, but there's that one sticky issue, right? It's the GDP reports, right? So this is the one you've been hearing about, right? 2 quarters of consecutive negative GDP growth, right? So GDP went down about 1.6% in the first quarter, that is January to March. And then in the second quarter, we had about a negative 0.9% decline in real GDP. And so you've maybe heard this before, that 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth equals recession, right? And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, this is genuinely a real definition that people have used, right? So you're hearing ridiculous things on both sides. You're hearing people say that this has never been a definition of GDP that people have used, right? And you're having people saying that this is the only definition of GDP until the Biden administration just changed it because they don't want the economy to look bad. Both of those are absolutely ridiculous statements. I mean, batshit crazy, stupid statements, okay? So, what is the real story? Okay. There is a organization in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research. They've always been responsible for telling us when we are in a recession, and they've always used a variety of criteria to determine that, including negative GDP growth, but also unemployment, changes in payroll, changes in wages, changes in business investment, changes in profits, right? They're looking at the entire spectrum of economic data to determine what's actually going on. Now, what then is this? So, and to be perfectly clear, the NBER has never used 2 quarters of negative GDP growth as their definition of a recession. As far as I'm aware, never once in their history. Now, having said that, is 2 quarters of negative GDP growth a definition of a recession? Absolutely it is. It's called, some people call it a definition of a technical recession, things like that. I have taught this in my class. Other econ professors have taught this in their class. Probably other econ professors that are now trying to tell everybody that this has never been a definition for GDP. It's 100% a rule of thumb definition that we have used in the past in the US, at least since the 1970s, as far as I'm aware. Again, I'm not a historian on specific metrics and when they came about, but I know that this was used going way back. So why do people use the 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth definition? And why is it not the best definition? Those are the questions that I think most people have. Okay, so essentially the 2 quarters of negative GDP growth is just an easy thing to tell people, right? It's a good rule of thumb that's very simple to explain to students, to non-economists, to people who are not versed in all of the different metrics that the NBER would normally use to date a recession, right? Everybody kind of has a general gist of what GDP is. When GDP goes down, aggregate incomes are going down, right? So everybody kind of understands that, and that's why it's a good kind of rule of thumb that we use to talk about. And in most cases, when we're in a recession, 2 quarters of negative GDP growth happen, right? So that's the other big issue with that. Now, having said that, why is it a bad definition to use? Because again, not every recession looks the same. So for example, we were really close to having a 1-quarter recession when COVID hit, right? So oftentimes the thing that we're worried about in not using the 2 quarter of negative GDP growth definition is the opposite of what's going on now. It's having a really short, highly impactful recession, right? And when COVID hit, it hit in March of 2020, which is the first quarter. And we actually did end up with a negative quarterly growth because it hit so hard and so quickly, but we were really close to not. And if we didn't have that negative quarter in Q1 of 2020, but we had it in Q2 and we rebounded by Q3, no one would have doubted that that was a recession, right? I mean, we had the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression in a matter of a few weeks. So no one would have doubted that was a recession, but it was very close to being not fitting the 2 quarter of negative GDP growth definition. The second thing is, like we have what's going on now is that you know, we might have a bit of declining productivity that's probably related to the worker shortage that we have right now. And if you're interested in that, we actually have a video on that we'll put up here in the card. Actually, here in the card. Which way does it go? Okay. And so we have a worker shortage that is reducing our productivity, and that is probably impacting our GDP. Now, the other thing that you guys have to remember is that most of this data is still preliminary, right? This is not the final data put out by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, that measures GDP changes quarter to quarter, right? This data takes a tremendously long time to collect and analyze and correct for statistical anomalies in the sampling process. And so they release a preliminary report. That report is almost always revised, and in most cases it's revised to a fairly significant degree, right? So it could be the case that this Q2 data, for example, that shows a very moderate decline in real GDP, again, a negative 0.9% decline, might actually end up being positive when the final numbers come out, right? And I actually personally expect that to be the case. I expect us to have basically either a slightly positive or zero growth for Q2 when the final numbers come out. Because again, this is hard to date. Okay, so right about this point in the video, you're probably going, hey, jackass, you're sounding like all the clowns on the internet right now. You're throwing a bunch of jargon at me, and all I want to know is, are we actually in a recession? And while I will reiterate, this is not a simple answer, I'll give you my answer, which is no, we are not in a recession. We are not fitting any of the criteria that the NBER uses for recession. We have strong job growth. We have strong business investment. We have strong profits. And actually, in the last month, real incomes even went up, even with the high inflation that we've experienced. So, no, we're not in a recession. Now, does that mean that it's all good news? No. I'm still worried about two things primarily that I'm watching like a hawk, and I think you should too. Number one, we still have a significant amount of inflation, right? So the July report for the CPI looked good, but again, core CPI is still pushing prices up at an unprecedented rate since the early 80s, right? This is affecting people's real income. This is affecting people's budgeting. Particularly people in the lower part of the income distribution are being hurt tremendously by this. And this still has a major potential to cause problems. Now, even worse than that is a lot of the negative wage growth that we've seen has been in the higher part of the income distribution. And we are coming up on a new corporate fiscal year. And I'm a bit worried that a lot of those higher earners are going to be asking for big raises when their contract comes up for renewal, right? And if that's the case, that could reignite some of this inflation that we've already been experiencing and make the problem way more difficult for the Fed. So again, what we want to do is we want to just think about this. So if we've got a person that makes $30,000 a year and they ask for a 10% raise to adjust their wage rate for inflation, again, that cost of living adjustment that we've talked about in previous videos, then that's an extra $3,000 cost for that employer, right? If a person that makes $300,000 asks for a 10% raise, well, now they're asking for a raise equivalent to the entire salary of that low-wage worker, right? This has the potential to tremendously increase costs of employers, which could then pass through to prices for us. And this is called a wage price spiral, right? And it's been the primary concern that the Fed has had since all this has began. So that is one big concern that I have. Now, concern two I have was kind of hidden in the Bureau of Labor Statistics' latest report. So productivity, worker productivity, which is defined by total output divided by hours worked, is down for July about 4.6%, which is not great news. It's particularly not great news when you consider the fact that hours worked are actually up. Now, why is this so concerning to me? Well, let's break that down. So it means that people are working more, but they're being less productive. If you couple this with the well-known worker shortage, which again, we've done a video on, I think what we're doing is we're burning out our labor force, right? People are working overtime, we're overworking people, we're making people do the jobs of 2 or 3 employees, and they have had enough. They're at their wits' end, and their productivity is actually starting to decline at this point. And if that's the case, that's a real big concern for the US moving forward, right? This could be a major point of concern and be the catalyst for an eventual recession, right? But I reiterate, we're not there yet. So folks, trust the numbers, not the hype. Pay attention to whether somebody seems to have an agenda. And if their primary thing that they talk about is politics, please, for the love of God, don't listen to them when it comes to economic issues. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.